Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Weaver Beyond the Numbers. I'm your host for today, Gabrielle, and right now I'm thrilled to be joined by Mike Collier, who's partner at Transaction Advisory Services. Thank you so much for joining us, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So to start us off, Mike, you've discussed the shift from conceptualization to investment and energy transition specifically, but can you share some more of the insights from within your research?
Well, what I looked at is, private equity and whether private equity is investing in energy transition. We have to put a lot of capital to work to keep up with energy demand and do the things that we have to do technically. I call it managing the chemistry of our atmosphere. And I wanted to see whether or not private equity was investing in the space for the very simple reason, which is that private equity will only invest when there are returns. They're very disciplined about making money on the money that they put to work. And I believe that the only way that we're going to assemble the capital that we have to is to do it the good old-fashioned way, where folks make money by doing it. And so is private equity investing or are they not? That was the question. I found it to be very fascinating, the results.
So just going the old-fashioned way, well, how do you envision the trajectory of private equity's involvement in energy transition, especially with the evolution of time?
Well, so first let me tell you what I saw in the history. So I looked at two deals that were done in 2023. And then I compared them to deals that were done in 2018. I looked at all of the energy transactions in the United States, over 50 million, and there was about just under 1,000 transactions that I looked at. And then I sliced and diced, so to speak, to see how many of those transactions were private equity and how many of those private equity transactions were in traditional energy versus energy transition, and what were the trends. And what I saw was astounding. The increase in private equity investing in just 5 years, between 2018 and 2023, was 7,000%, more than 7,000%. And it's almost caught up with private equity investing in traditional energy. So I found that to be intriguing, and that's that's an indication that that you can make money in energy transition. However, what I discovered which was quite fascinating, is a lot of those private equity deals weren't buyouts, but they were credit deals where they were loaning companies money. And that's a very, very different proposition. If private equity buys a company, it's because they believe that company will become much, much more valuable in a reasonably short period of time. That's how that works. But they're lending money to these operations. And so that means that they'll get their money back, is the expectation. But will that company really grow and produce the returns that private equity needs? So the conclusion is it's too soon to tell, but it's definitely going to be worth watching.
Wow, yeah, because that's a pretty big jump, 7,000%. And there's a lot of new players in the space that we're seeing. So do you believe that right now all these new players, are they actually equipped to navigate, all the complexities that are happening in energy transition right now?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, because there's so much new about what's happening in energy investing. And I looked at that. I looked to see in the data what conclusions could I draw from that. First of all, I was delighted to see some good old familiar names. So these are private equity funds that have been investing in traditional oil and gas for years and years and years. I've worked with many of them. I help put deals together. So I saw them moving into the transition space, which I thought was very encouraging. But also the funds whose names that I didn't recognize. And I've been doing this for a long, long time in Texas. The funds whose names I didn't recognize outnumbered the names that I did recognize by a factor of 10 to 1. So what that means is there's an awful lot of enthusiasm in energy transition. There's demand for transition. The various markets and stakeholders of every kind and character are demanding it. And the expectation is that trillions of dollars will be invested in it. And that attracts a lot of attention, and that has attracted a lot of new private equity funds to the energy industry. So it'll be interesting to see how they do. One of the things that that I know from my work with private equity is, if it's an old traditional space and people have experience and cumulative knowledge, they know how to make investments and they know how to make money. If it's new, they only think they're going to make money. But there's an awful lot of uncertainties. So we'll just have to see how this plays out. The performance of today's investment will inform their judgment as to how much more money they can raise and how much more money they can put to work.
Yeah, a lot of uncertainties, but the demand is definitely there. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act, actually, because that recent passage, how do you anticipate that, right, influencing private equity investment in this sector particularly?
Well, I'll say two things about the IRA. First of all, in the data that I looked at, the most recent period was 2023. That was only a year after the IRA was passed. And it takes time to tee up an investment and to execute on it and do the due diligence. That's the work that I do. And so I think 2023 is a bit too soon to draw any conclusions as it relates to laws that were enacted in 2022. However, we do know from looking at what happened in the wind industry, and this is pre-IRA, but this is many years ago, the subsidies for wind. We wouldn't have a wind industry if it wasn't for the subsidies to get them started. Nobody would have invested in wind farms. It couldn't make money except for the government subsidies. Well, that resulted in an industry with economies of scale, where costs fell dramatically. And now the folks that invest in wind are telling me they don't need subsidies anymore, that they can make money. I suspect that we'll find the same thing in their other newer areas of energy transition. I think those subsidies will attract capital. That there's a lot of complexity. It's not as easy as it looks, and I'll have a lot to say about that in the future. But it will attract capital, but the important thing is that it's temporary. So once industries develop, whether it's the hydrogen industry, whether it's geothermal, whether it's carbon capture, and capital gets put to work, costs will come down. People will have a better idea of how they can make investments, and the subsidies won't be necessary. And one of the things I like about the IRA is that it's all temporary. That strikes me as very good policy.
Absolutely. And I mean, this takes us more into like long-term impacts. So what are your thoughts on long-term impacts of policies like the Inflation Reduction Act? I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think, it's going to be interesting when you talk to private equity investors, and I talk to a lot of them. The challenge presently with investing in energy transition is the returns aren't what they're used to. I mean, the returns in oil and gas can be quite large. And private equity funds are very, very good and very, very disciplined at going after those returns. You can't say the same thing about energy transition. It's a different world, so you're not seeing those kinds of returns presently, which is why the bulk of energy transition investing is happening by big corporations. So private equity they're there and they're growing, but they're still a relatively small part of the equation. But what I expect will happen over time is as big companies drive investments, create industries with multiple players and multiple assets, then private equity will be in a position to do what private equity does best and where they can find returns, which is go find these assets that somebody else put together that are in a large company's portfolio, and they'll have assets that are just under-optimized. Big companies will have lots and lots of energy assets, and they find that they can't tend to all of them, and private equity can go to them and say, look, here's an asset that we can do so much more with. And that results in a transaction, that results in private equity doing one of the things that they do best, is to take really, really high impact executives and put them to work on an energy asset that has been kind of neglected. And then you just stand back and watch those executives do remarkable things to create value. And then the other thing that private equity is very, very good at is finding ways to consolidate where two companies might have similar assets. It's much more valuable to combine those two assets, so you have to buy this asset from this company and buy this asset from that company and combine them, and now you can create a much more valuable. And so it's a consolidation play, and private equity is very, very good at that. So it's a long way of saying I'm delighted to see private equity involved in energy transition. I think the future is going to be much more interesting than the present. And then the last thing I'd like to say is that this IRA situation and taking advantage of these credits, it's a whole lot harder than it looks. Some of the credits, investment tax credits or production tax credits, the first, say, 30% of the money available to you is pretty straightforward. But all of the other increments that you can add to it create operational challenges that private equity funds and really the whole industry are growing accustomed to. For example, you might want credits associated with having contractors and subcontractors paying their people the appropriate wage. If they don't pay the appropriate wage, or if they don't have the appropriate apprentices, you can't get that credit. But this is a subcontractor that's doing it. It's to some extent beyond your control, and you talk to private equity funds and they say, you know, we're having to become labor relations people. We're having to become HR people. We're having to become demographers. So there's just an awful lot of learning that has to happen. But it will happen.
Yeah, well, it's harder than it looks, but you're making it sound easy. So those are some of those long-term impacts. Well, in terms of implications, I mean, what does energy transition hold for traditional oil and gas industries? What's your outlook?
Well, we're always going to need oil and gas.
Yeah.
And I'm not only saying that because I've made my living in the oil and gas industry. We're always going to need oil and gas. The question is, we have to generate an awful lot of energy of every kind for a planet that is growing in terms of energy demand. We have to. But we also have to manage the chemistry of our atmosphere. And the way I think of it is, for every carbon molecule that goes up, we have to bring one down. And so that means that we have to do innumerable things better than we do now. You know, for example, land use, construction materials. We produce more carbon per person than we can actually pull down from the atmosphere, so we have to do all sorts of things. And it has to be driven by innovation, because you can't ask people just won't necessarily voluntarily sacrifice. You have to give them a product that's lower carbon, but they like it better, so that they buy it. Those innovations are happening. The oil and gas industry, to my observation, is focusing quite a lot on the carbon capture side of the equation. So for every carbon molecule that goes up, one's got to come down. And I think that's really, really smart, because in order to effectively capture and store carbon, you've got to understand geology, because that's where we're going to park that carbon, is in old reservoirs. And so the oil industry, I think, is very wise to say, look, we're going to play our part. We're going to keep producing energy for the world, but then we're also going to, you know, have a pretty big hand in terms of how do we capture the excess carbon and file it away.
Absolutely. Well, do you have any last thoughts for our audience before we start wrapping up the podcast?
Well, I would just say stay tuned. I mean, this is all new. I call it whiteboarding talk. I've been listening to the energy transition whiteboarding talk now for quite a long time. The folks who are experts in climate say that we are not investing fast enough. If that's true, then I would expect investment to accelerate. I would expect that private equity will learn a lot along the way, and we'll be watching them very carefully to see. And I think it's going to be one of the most fascinating times in the energy industry.
It definitely sounds like that. Well, that wraps up the conversation for today. So thank you, Mike, for joining us on today's podcast to share insights on the pivotal role that private equity is playing on driving energy transition today. So thank you.
Thank you, Gabby.
Absolutely. And as always, for those listening in, please visit weaver.com to listen to this podcast and others. I've been your host, Gabrielle. Thanks for tuning in.